Welcome to Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Wieland, or The Transformation, by Charles Brockton Brown, chapters 10 through 14.
Chapter 10. Order could not readily be introduced into my thoughts. The voice still rung in my ears. Every accent that was uttered by Carwin was fresh in my remembrance. His unwelcome approach, the recognition of his person, his hasty departure, produced a complex impression on my mind which no words can delineate. I strove to give a slower motion to my thoughts, and to regulate a confusion which became painful. But my efforts were nugatory. I covered my eyes with my hand and sat, I know not how long, without power to arrange or utter my conceptions. I had remained for hours, as I believed, in absolute solitude. No thought of personal danger had molested my tranquility. I had made no preparation for defense. What was it that suggested the design of pursuing my father's manuscript? If instead of this, I had retired to bed and to sleep, to what fate might I not have been reserved? The ruffian, who must always have suppressed his breathing to screen himself from discovery, would have noticed this signal, and I should have awakened only to perish with affright or to abhor myself. Could I have remained unconscious of my danger? Could I have tranquilly slept in the midst of so deadly a snare? And who was he that threatened to destroy me? By what means could he hide himself in this closet? Surely he is gifted with supernatural power. Such is the enemy of whose attempts I was forewarned. Daily I had seen him and conversed with him. Nothing could be discerned through the impenetrable veil of his duplicity. When busied in conjectures as to the author of the evil that was threatened, my mind did not light for a moment upon his image. Yet he was not avowed himself my enemy? Why should he be here if he had not meditated evil? He confesses that this was his second attempt. What was the scene of his former conspiracy? Was it not he whose whispers betrayed him? Am I deceived, or was there not a faint resemblance between the voice of this man and that which talked of grasping my throat and extinguishing my life in a moment? Then he had a colleague in his crime. Now he is alone. Then death was the scope of his thoughts. Now an injury unspeakably more dreadful. How thankful I should be to the power that has interposed to save me. That power is invisible. It is subject to the cognizance of my senses. What are the means that will inform me of what nature it is? He has set himself to counterwork the machinations of this man, who had menaced destruction to all that is dear to me, and whose cunning had surmounted every human impediment. There was none to rescue me from his grasp. My rashness even hastened the completion of this scheme, and precluded him from the benefits of deliberation. I had robbed him of the power to repent and forbear. Had I been apprised of the danger, I should have regarded my conduct as the means of rendering my escape from it impossible. Such, likewise, seemed to have been the fears of my invisible protector. Else why that startling entreaty to refrain from opening the closet? By what inexplicable infatuation was I compelled to proceed? Yet my conduct was wise. Carwin, unable to comprehend my folly, ascribed my behavior to my knowledge. He conceived himself previously detected, and such detection being possible to flow only from my heavenly friend and his enemy, his fears acquired additional strength. He is apprised of the nature and intentions of this being. Perhaps he is a human agent. Yet on that supposition, his achievements are incredible. Why should I be selected as the object of his care, or, if a mere mortal, should I not recognize someone whom benefits imparted and received had prompted to love me? What were the limits and duration of his guardianship? Was the genius of my birth entrusted by divine benignity with his province? Are human faculties adequate to receive stronger proofs of the existence of unfettered and beneficent intelligences than I have received? But who was this man's coadjutor? The voice that acknowledged an alliance in treachery with Carwin warned me to avoid the summer house. He assured me that there were only my safety was in danger. His assurance, as it now appears, was fallacious. Was there not deceit in his admonition? Was his compact really annulled? Some purpose was, perhaps, to be accomplished by preventing my future visits to that spot. why was I enjoined silence to others on the subject of this admonition, unless it was for some unauthorized and guilty purpose? No one but myself was accustomed to visit it. Backward, it was hidden from distant view by the rock, and in front, it was screened by all examination by creeping plants and the branches of cedars. What recesses could be more propitious to secrecy? The spirit which haunted it formerly was pure and rapturous. It was a fane sacred to the memory of infantile days and to bliss imaginations of the future. What a gloomy reverse had succeeded since the ominous arrival of this stranger. Now, perhaps, it is the scene of his meditations, purposes fraught with horror that shun the light and contemplate the pollution of innocence are here engendered and fostered and reared to maturity. Such were the ideas that during the night were tumultuously revolved by me. I reviewed every conversation in which Carwin had borne a part. I studied to discover the true inferences deducible from his deportment and words with regard to his former adventures and actual views. I pondered on the comments which he made on the relation which I had given of the closet dialogue. No new ideas suggested themselves in the course of his review. My expectation had, from the first, been disappointed on the small degree of surprise which his narrative excited in him. He never explicitly declared his opinion as to the nature of those voices, or decided whether they were real or visionary. He recommended no measures of caution or prevention. But what measures were to be taken now? Was the danger which threatened me at an end? Had I nothing more to fear? I was lonely and without means of defense. I could not calculate the motives and regulate the footsteps of this person. What certainty was there that he would not reassume his purposes and swiftly return to the execution of them? This idea covered me once more with dismay. How deeply did I regret the solitude in which I was placed, and how ardently did I desire the return of day. But neither of these inconveniences were susceptible of remedy. At first, it occurred to me to summon my servant and make her spend the night in my chamber, but the inefficacy of this expedient to enhance my safety was easily seen. Once I resolved to leave the house and retire to my brother's, but was deterred by reflecting on the unseasonableness of the hour, on the alarm which my arrival and the account which I should be obliged to give might occasion, and on the danger to which I might expose myself in the way thither. I began likewise to consider Carwin's return to molest me as exceedingly improbable. He had relinquished, of his own accord, his design and departed without compulsion. Surely, I said, there is omnipotence in the cause that changed the views of a man like Carwin. The divinity that shielded me from his attempts will take suitable care of my future safety. Thus, to yield to my fears is to deserve that they should be real. Scarcely had I uttered these words when my attention was startled by the sound of footsteps. They denoted someone stepping into the piazza in front of my house. My newborn confidence was extinguished in a moment. Carwin, I thought, had repented his departure and was hastily returning. The possibility that his return was prompted by intentions consistent with my safety found no place in my mind. Images of violation and murder assailed me anew, and the terrors which succeeded almost incapacitated me from taking any measures for my defense. It was an impulse of which I was scarcely conscious, that made me fasten the lock and draw the bolts of my chamber door. Having done this, I threw myself on a seat, for I trembled to a degree which disabled me from standing, and my soul was so perfectly absorbed in the act of listening that almost the vital motions were stopped. The door below creaked on its hinges. It was not again thrust to, but appeared to remain open. Footsteps entered, traversed the entryway, and began to mount the stairs. How I detested the folly of not pursuing the man when he withdrew, and bolting after him the outer door. Might he not conceive this omission to be a proof that my angel had deserted me, and thereby fortified in guilt? Every step on the stairs, which brought him nearer to my chamber, added vigor to my desperation. The evil with which I was menaced was to be at any rate eluded. How little did I preconceive the conduct which, in an exigence like this, I should be prone to adopt. You will suppose that deliberation and despair would have suggested the same course of action, and that I should have unhesitatingly resorted to the best means of personal defense within my power. A penknife lay open on my table. I remembered that it was there and seized it. For what purpose, you will scarcely inquire. It will be immediately supposed that I meant it for my last refuge, that if all of their means should fail, I should plunge it into the heart of my ravisher. I have lost all faith in the steadfastness of human resolves. It was thus that in periods of calm I had determined to act. No cowardice had been held by me in greater abhorrence than that which prompted an injured female to destroy not her injurer ere the injury was perpetrated, but herself when it was without remedy. Yet now this penknife appeared to me of no other use than to baffle my assailant and prevent the crime by destroying myself. To deliberate at such a time was impossible, but among the tumultuous suggestions of the moment, I do not recollect that it once occurred to me to use it as an instrument of direct defense. The steps had now reached the second floor. Every footfall accelerated the completion, without augmenting, the certainty of evil. The consciousness that the door was fast, now that nothing but that was interposed between me and the danger, was a source of some consolation. I cast my eye toward the window. This, likewise, was a new suggestion. If the door should give way, it was my sudden resolution to throw myself from the window. Its height from the ground, which was covered beneath by brick pavement, would ensure my destruction, but I thought not of that. When opposite to my door the footsteps ceased. Was he listening whether my fears were allayed and my caution were asleep? Did he hope to take me by surprise? Yet if so, why did he allow so many noisy signals to betray his approach? Presently, the steps were again heard to approach the door. A hand was laid upon the lock and the latch pulled back. Did he imagine it possible that I should fail to secure the door? A slight effort was made to push it open, as if all bolts being withdrawn, a slight effort only was required. I no sooner perceived this than I moved swiftly towards the window. Carwin's frame might be said to be all muscle. His strength and activity had appeared, in various instances, to be prodigious. A slight exertion of his force would demolish the door. Would not that exertion be made? Too surely it would, but at the same moment that this obstacle should yield, and he should enter the apartment, my determination was formed to leap from the window. My senses were still bound to this object. I gazed at the door in momentary expectation that the assault would be made. The pause continued. The person without was irresolute and motionless. Suddenly it occurred to me that Carwin might conceive me to have fled. That I had not betaken myself to flight was indeed the least probable of all conclusions. In this persuasion he must have been confirmed on finding the lower door unfastened and the chamber door locked. Was it not wise to foster this persuasion? Should I maintain deep silence, this, in addition to other circumstances, might encourage the belief, and he would once more depart. Every new reflection added plausibility to this reasoning. It was presently more strongly enforced when I noticed footsteps withdrawing from the door. The blood once more flowed back to my heart, and a dawn of exaltation began to rise. But my joy was short-lived. Instead of descending the stairs, he passed to the door of the opposite chamber, opened it, and having entered, shut it after him with a violence that shook the house. How was I to interpret this circumstance? For what end could he have entered this chamber? Did the violence with which he closed the door testify to the depth of his vexation? This room was usually occupied by Pleyel. Was Carwin aware of his absence on this night? Could he be suspected of a design so sordid as pillage? If this were his view, there were no means in my power to frustrate it. It behooved me to seize the first opportunity to escape. But if my escape were supposed by my enemy to have been already effected, no asylum was more secure than the present. How could my passage from the house be accomplished without noises that might entice him to pursue me? Utterly at a loss to account for this going into Pleyel's chamber, I waited in instant expectation of hearing him come forth. All, however, was profoundly still. I listened in vain for a considerable period to catch the sound of the door when it should again be opened. There was no other avenue by which he could escape, but a door which led into the girl's chamber. Would any evil from this quarter befall the girl? Hence arose a new train of apprehensions. They merely added to the turbulence and agony of my reflections. Whatever evil impended over her, I had no power to avert it. Seclusion and silence were the only means of saving myself from the perils of this fatal night. What solemn vows did I put up, that if I should once more behold the light of day, I would never trust myself again within the threshold of this dwelling. Minute lingered after minute. but no token was given that Carwin had returned to the passage. What, I again asked, could detain him in his room? Was it possible that he had returned and glided unperceived away? I was speedily aware of the difficulty that attended an enterprise like this, and yet, as if by that means I were capable of gaining any information on that head, I cast anxious looks from the window. The object that first attracted my attention was a human figure standing on the edge of the bank. Perhaps my penetration was assisted by my hopes. Be that as it will, the figure of Carwin was clearly distinguishable. From the obscurity of my station, it was impossible that I should be discerned by him, and yet he scarcely suffered me to catch a glimpse of him. He turned and went down the steep, which, in this part, was not difficult to be scaled. My conjecture, then, had been right. Carwin has softly opened the door, descended the stairs, and issued forth. That I should not have overheard his steps was only less incredible than my eyes had deceived me. But what was now to be done? The house was at length delivered from this detested inmate. By one avenue might he again re-enter. Was it not wise to bar the lower door? Perhaps he had gone out by the kitchen door. For this end he must have passed through Judith's chamber, these entrances being closed and bolted, as great security was gained as was compatible with my lonely condition. The propriety of these measures was too manifest not to make me struggle successfully with my fears. Yet I opened my own door with the utmost caution and descended, as if I were afraid that Carwin had been still immured in Pleyel's chamber. The outer door was ajar. I shut with trembling eagerness and drew every bolt that appended it. I then passed with light and less cautious steps through the parlor, but was surprised to discover that the kitchen door was secure. I was compelled to acquiesce in the first conjecture that Carwin had escaped through the entry. My heart was now somewhat eased of the load of apprehension. I returned once more to my chamber, the door of which I was careful to lock. It was no time to think of repose. The moonlight began already to fade before the light of the day. The approach of morning was betokened by the usual signals. I mused upon the events of this night and determined to take up my abode henceforth at my brother's. Whether I should inform him of what had happened was a question which seemed to demand some consideration. My safety unquestionably required that I should abandon my present habitation. As my thoughts began to flow with fewer impediments, the image of Pleyel and the dubiousness of his condition again recurred to me. I again ran over the plausible causes of his absence on the preceding day. My mind was attuned to melancholy. I dwelt, with an obstinacy for which I could not account, on the idea of his death. I painted to myself his struggles with the billows and his last appearance. I imagined myself a midnight wanderer on the shore, and to have stumbled on his corpse, which the tide had cast up. These dreary images affected me even to tears. I endeavored not to restrain them. They imparted a relief which I had not anticipated. The more copiously they flowed, the more did my general sensations appear to subside into calm, and a certain restlessness give way to repose. Perhaps, relieved by this effusion, the slumber so much wanted might have stolen on my senses, had there been no new cause of alarm. Chapter 11. I was aroused from this stupor by sounds that evidently arose in the next chamber. Was it possible that I had been mistaken in the figure which I had seen on the bank? Or had Carwin, by some inscrutable means, penetrated once more into this chamber? The opposite door opened, footsteps came forth, and the person, advancing to mine, knocked. So unexpected an incident robbed me of all presence of mind, and starting up, I involuntarily exclaimed, "Who is there?" An answer was immediately given. The voice, to my inexpressible astonishment, was Pleyel's. "It is I. Have you risen? If you have not, make haste. I want 3 minutes' conversation with you in the parlor. I will wait for you there." Saying this, he retired from the door. Should I confide in the testimony of my ears? If that were true, it was Pleyel that had been hitherto immured in the opposite chamber, he whom my rueful fancy had depicted in so many ruinous and ghastly shapes, he whose footsteps had been listened to with such inquietude. What is man that knowledge is so sparingly conferred upon him, that his heart should be wrung with distress and his frame exanimated with fear, though his safety be encompassed with impregnable walls? What are the bounds of human imbecility? He that warned me of the presence of my foe refused the intimation by which so many racking fears would have been precluded. Yet who would have imagined the arrival of Pleyel at such an hour? His tone was desponding and anxious. Why this unreasonable summons? And why this hasty departure? Some tidings he, perhaps, bears of mysterious and unwelcome import. My impatience would not allow me to consume much time in deliberation. I hastened down. Pleyel I found standing at a window, with eyes cast down as in meditation, and arms folded on his breast. Every line in his countenance was pregnant with sorrow. To this was added a certain wanness and air of fatigue. The last time I had seen him appearances had been the reverse of these. I was startled at the change. The first impulse was to question him as to the cause. This impulse was supplanted by some degree of confusion, flowing from a consciousness that love had too large and, as it might prove, perceptible share in creating this impulse. I was silent. Presently, he raised his eyes and fixed them upon me. I read in them an anguish altogether ineffable. Never had I witnessed a like demeanor in Pleyel. Never, indeed, had I observed an human countenance in which grief was more legibly inscribed. He seemed struggling for utterance, but his struggles being fruitless, he shook his head and turned away from me. My impatience would not allow me to be longer silent. "What," I said, "for heaven's sake, my friend, is the matter?" He started at the sound of my voice. His looks for a moment became convulsed with an emotion very different from grief. His accents were broken with rage. "The matter? Oh, wretch, thus exquisitely fashioned, on whom nature seemed to have exhausted all her graces, with charms so awful and so pure. How art thou fallen? From what height fallen? A ruin so complete, so unheard of." His words were again choked by emotion. Grief and pity were again mingled in his features. He resumed in a tone half suffocated by sobs. "But why should I upbraid thee? Could I restore to thee what thou hast lost? Efface this cursed stain, snatch thee from the jaws of this fiend, I would do it. Yet what will avail my efforts? I have not arms with which to contend with so consummate, so frightful a depravity. Evidence less than this would only have excited resentment and scorn. The wretch who should have breathed a suspicious injurious to thy honor would have been regarded without anger. Not hatred or envy could have prompted him, and it would merely be an argument of madness. That my eyes and my ears should bear witness to thy fall, by no other way could detestable conviction be imparted. Why do I summon thee to this conference? Why expose myself to thy derision? Here admonition and entreaty are vain. Thou knowest him already for a murderer and a thief. I had thought to have been the first to disclose to thee his infamy, to have warned thee of the pit to which thou art hastening, but thy eyes are open in vain. O foul and insupportable disgrace! There is but one path. I know you will despair together. In thy ruin, how will the felicity and honor of multitudes be involved? But it must come. This scene shall not be blotted by his presence. No doubt thou wilt shortly see thy detested paramour. This scene will again be polluted by a midnight assignation. Inform him of his danger. Tell him that his crimes are known. Let him fly far and instantly from this spot, if he desires to avoid the fate which menaced him in Ireland. And wilt thou not stay behind? But shame upon my weakness. I know not what I would say. I have done what I proposed. To stay longer, to expostulate, to beseech, to enumerate the consequences of thy act. What end can serve but to blazon thy infamy and embitter our woes? And yet, oh, think ere it be too late on the distress which thy flight will entail upon us, on the base, groveling, and atrocious character of the wretch to whom thou hast sold
thy honor. But what is this? Is not thy effrontery impenetrable, and thy heart thoroughly cankered? O most specious and profligate of women! Saying this, he rushed out of the house. I saw him in a few moments hurrying along the path which led to my brother's. I had no power to prevent his going or recall or to follow him. The accents I heard were calculated and confound to bewilder. I looked around me to assure myself that the scene was real. I moved that I might banish the doubt that I was awake. Such enormous imputations from the mouth of Pleyel, to be stigmatized with the names of wanton and profligate, to be charged with sacrifice of honor, with midnight meetings, and a wretch known to be a murderer and a thief, with an intention to fly in his company? What I had heard was surely the dictate of frenzy, or it was built upon some fatal, some incomprehensible mistake. After the horrors of the night, after undergoing perils so imminent from this man, to be summoned to an interview like this, to find Pleyel fraught with the belief that instead of having chosen death as a refuge from the violence of this man, I had hugged his baseness to my heart, had sacrificed for him my purity, my spotless name, my friendships, and my fortune. That even madness could engender accusations like these was not to be believed. What evidence could possibly suggest conceptions so wild? After the unlooked-for interview with Carwin in my chamber, he retired. Could Pleyel have observed his exit? It was not long after that Pleyel himself entered. Did he build on this incident his odious conclusions? Could the long series of my actions and sentiments grant me no exemption from suspicion so foul? Was it not more rational to infer that Carwin's designs had been illicit, that my life had been endangered by the fury of one whom, by some means, had discovered to be an assassin and robber, that my honor had been assailed not by blandishments but by violence? He has judged me without hearing. He has drawn from dubious appearances conclusions the most improbable and unjust. He has loaded me with all outrageous epithets. He has ranked me with prostitutes and thieves. I cannot pardon thee, Pleyel, for this injustice. Thy understanding must be hurt. If it be not, if thy conduct was sober and deliberate, I can never forgive an outrage so unmanly and so gross. These thoughts gradually gave place to others. Pleyel was possessed by some momentary frenzy. Appearances had led him into palpable errors. Whence could his sagacity have contracted this blindness? Was it not love? Previously assured of my affection for Carwin, distracted with grief and jealousy, and impelled hither at that late hour by some unknown instigation, his imagination transformed shadows into monsters, and plunged him into these deplorable errors. This idea was not unattended with consolation. My soul was divided between indignation at his injustice and delight on account of the source from which I conceived it to spring. For a long time they would allow admission to no other thoughts. Surprise is an emotion that enfeebles, not invigorates. All my meditations were accompanied with wonder. I rambled with vagueness, or clung to one image with an obstinacy which sufficiently testified the maddening influences of late transactions. Gradually, I proceeded to reflect upon the consequences of Pleyel's mistake, and on the measures I should take to guard myself against future injury from Carwin. Should I suffer this mistake to be detected by time? When his passion should subside, would he not perceive the flagrancy of his injustice and hasten to atone for it? Did it not become my character to testify resentment for language and treatment so uproarious? Wrapped up in the consciousness of innocence, and confiding in the influence of time and reflection, to confute so groundless a charge, it was my province to be passive and silent. As to the violences meditated by Carwin and the means of eluding them, the path to be taken by me was obvious. I resolved to tell the tale to my brother and regulate myself to his advice. For this end, when the morning was somewhat advanced, I took the way to his house. My sister was engaged in her customary occupations. As soon as I appeared, she remarked a change in my looks. I was not willing to alarm her by the information which I had to communicate. Her health was in that condition which rendered a disastrous tale particularly unsuitable. I forbore direct answer to her inquiries, and inquired in my turn for Wieland. "Why," she said, "I suspect something mysterious and unpleasant has happened this morning. Scarcely had we risen when Pleyel dropped among us. What could have prompted him to make us so early and so unseasonable a visit, I cannot tell. To judge from the disorder of his dress and his countenance, something of extraordinary nature has occurred. He permitted me merely to know that he had slept none, nor even undressed during the past night. He took your brother to walk with him. Some topic must have deeply engaged them, for Wieland did not return till the breakfast hour was past, and returned alone. His disturbance was excessive, but he would not listen to my importunities or tell me what happened. I gathered from hints which he let fall that your situation was in some way the cause. Yet he assured me that you were at your house, alive, in good health, and in perfect safety. He scarcely ate a morsel, and immediately after breakfast went out again. He would not inform me whither he was going, but mentioned that he might probably not return before midnight. I was equally astonished and alarmed by this information. Pleyel had told his tale to my brother, and had, by a plausible and exaggerated picture, instilled into him unfavorable thoughts of me. Yet would not the more correct judgment of Wieland perceive and expose the fallacy of his conclusions? Perhaps his uneasiness might arise from some insight into the character of Carwin, and from apprehensions for my safety. The appearances by which Pleyel had been misled might induce him, likewise, to believe that I entertained an indiscreet, though not dishonorable affection for Carwin. Such were the conjectures rapidly formed. I was inexpressibly anxious to change them into certainty. For this end, an interview with my brother was desirable. He was gone, no one knew whither, and was not expectedly speedily to return. I had no clue by which to trace his footsteps. My anxieties could not be concealed from my sister. They heightened her solicitude to be acquainted with the cause. There were many reasons persuading me to silence. At least, till I had seen my brother, it would be an act of inexcusable temerity to unfold what had lately passed. No other expedient for eluding her importunities occurred to me, but that of returning to my own house. I recollected my determination to become a tenant of this roof. I mentioned it to her. She joyfully acceded to this proposal, and suffered me, with less reluctance, to depart, when I told her that it was with a view to collect and send to my new dwelling what articles would be immediately useful to me. Once more I returned to the house which had been the scene of so much turbulence and danger. I was at no great distance from it when I observed my brother coming out. On seeing me, he stopped, and after ascertaining, as it seemed, which way I was going, he returned into the house before me. I sincerely rejoiced at this event, and I hastened to set things, if possible, on their right footing. His brow was by no means expressive of those vehement emotions with which Pleyel had been agitated, but I drew a favorable omen from this circumstance. Without delay, I began the conversation. "I have been to look for you," said I, "but was told by Catherine that Pleyel had engaged you on some important and disagreeable affair. Before his interview with you, he spent a few minutes with me. These minutes he employed in upbraiding me for crimes and intentions with which I am by no means chargeable. I believe him to have taken up his opinions on very insufficient grounds. His behavior was in the highest degree precipitate and unjust, and, until I receive some atonement, I shall treat him, in my turn, with that contempt which he justly merits. Meanwhile, I am fearful that he has prejudiced my brother against me. That is an evil which I am most anxiously deprecate, and which I shall indeed exert myself to remove. Has he made me the subject of this morning's conversation?" My brother's countenance testified no surprise at my address. The benignity of his looks were no wise diminished. "It is true," said he. "Your conduct was the subject of our discourse. I am your friend as well as your brother. There is no human being whom I love with more tenderness, and whose welfare is nearer my heart. Judge then with what emotions I listened to Pleyel's story. I expect and desire you to vindicate yourself from aspersions so foul, if vindication be possible." The tone with which he uttered the last words affected me deeply. "If vindication be possible," repeated I. "From what you know, do you deem a formal vindication necessary? Can you harbor for a moment the belief of my guilt?" He shook his head with an air of acute anguish. "I have struggled," said he, "to dismiss that belief. You speak before a judge who will profit by any pretense to acquit you, who is ready to question his own senses when they plead against you." These words incited a new set of thoughts in my mind. I began to suspect that Pleyel had built his accusations on some foundation unknown to me. "I may be a stranger to the grounds of your belief. Pleyel loaded me with indecent and virulent invectives, but withheld from me the facts that generated his suspicions. Events took place last night of which some of the circumstances were of an ambiguous nature. I conceived that these might possibly have fallen under his cognizance, and that, viewed through the mists of prejudice and passion, they supplied a pretense for his conduct, but believed that your more unbiased judgment would estimate them at their value. Perhaps his tale has been different from what I suspect it to be. Listen, then, to my narrative. If there be anything in his story inconsistent with mine, his story is false." I then proceeded to a circumstantial relation of the incidents of the last night. Wieland listened with deep attention. Having finished, "This," continued I, "is the truth. You see in what circumstances an interview took place between Carwin and me. He remained for hours in my closet and for some minutes in my chamber. He departed without haste or interruption. If Pleyel marked him as he left the house, and it is not impossible that he did, inferences injurious to my character might suggest themselves to him. In admitting them, he gave proofs of less discernment and less candor than I once ascribed to him." "His proofs," said Wieland, after a considerable pause, "are different. That he should be deceived is not possible. That he himself is not the deceiver could not be believed. If his testimony were not inconsistent with yours, but the doubts which I entertained are now removed. Your tale, some parts of it, is marvelous. The voice which exclaimed against your rashness in approaching the closet, your persisting, notwithstanding that prohibition, your belief that I was the ruffian, and your subsequent conduct are believed by me, because I have known you from childhood, because 1,000 instances have attested to your veracity, and because nothing less than my own hearing and vision would convince me, in opposition to her own assertions, that my sister had fallen into wickedness like this." I threw my arms around him and bathed his cheek with tears. "That," said I, "is spoken like my brother. But what are the proofs?" He replied, "Pleyel informed me that, in going to your house, his attention was attracted by 2 voices. The persons speaking sat beneath the bank out of sight. These persons, judging by their voices, were Carwin and you. I will not repeat the dialogue. If my sister was the female, Pleyel was justified in concluding you to be, indeed, one of the most profligate of women. Hence, his accusations of you and his efforts to obtain my concurrence to a plan by which an eternal separation should be brought about between my sister and this man." I made Wieland repeat this recital. Here, indeed, was a tale to fill me with terrible foreboding. I had vainly thought that my safety could be sufficiently secured by doors and bars, but this is a foe from whose grasp no power of divinity can save me. His artifices will ever lay my fame and happiness at his mercy. How shall I counterwork his plots or detect his coadjutor? He has taught some vile and abandoned female to mimic my voice. Pleyel's ears were the witnesses of my dishonor. This is the midnight assignation to which he alluded. Thus is the silence he maintained when attempting to open the door of my chamber accounted for. He supposed me absent, and meant perhaps, had my apartment been accessible, to leave it in some accusing memorial. Pleyel was no longer equally culpable. The sincerity of his anguish, the depth of his despair, I remembered with some tendencies to gratitude. Yet was he not precipitate? Was the conjecture that my part was played by some mimic so utterly unattainable? Instances of this faculty are common. The wickedness of Carwin must, in his opinion, have been adequate to such contrivances, and yet the supposition of my guilt was adopted in preference to that. But how was this error to be unveiled? What but my own assertion had I to throw in the balance against it? Would this be permitted to outweigh the testimony of his senses? I had no witnesses to prove my existence in another place. The real events of that night are marvelous. Few to whom they should be related would scruple to discredit them. Pleyel is sceptical in a transcendent degree. I cannot summon Carwin to my bar and make him the attester of my innocence and the accuser of himself. My brother saw and comprehended my distress. He was unacquainted, however, with the full extent of it. He knew not by how many motives I was incited to retrieve the good opinion of Pleyel. He endeavored to console me. Some new event, he said, would occur to disentangle the maze. He did not question the influence of my eloquence, if I thought proper to exert it. Why not seek an interview with Pleyel and exact from him a minute relation, in which something may be met with serving to destroy the probability of the whole? I caught with eagerness at this hope, but my alacrity was dampened by new reflections. Should I, perfect in this respect, and unblemished as I was, thrust myself, uncalled, into his presence, and make my felicity depend upon his arbitrary verdict? "If you choose to seek an interview," continued Wieland, "you must make haste, for Pleyel informed me of his intention to set out this evening or tomorrow on a long journey." No intelligence was less expected or less welcome than this. I had thrown myself in a window seat, but now, starting on my feet, I exclaimed, "Good heavens! What is it you say? A journey? Whither? When?" "I cannot say whither. It is a sudden resolution, I believe. I did not hear of it till this morning. He promises to write me as soon as he is settled." I needed no further information as to the cause and issue of this journey. The scheme of happiness to which he had devoted his thoughts was blasted by the discovery of last night. My preference of another and my unworthiness to be any longer the object of his adoration were evinced by the same act and in the same moment. The thought of utter desertion, a desertion originating in such a cause, was the prelude to distraction. That Pleyel should abandon me forever because I was blind to his excellence, because I coveted pollution and wedded infamy, when, on the contrary, my heart was the shrine of all purity and beat only for his sake, was a destiny which, as long as my life was in my own hands, I would by no means consent to endure. I remembered that this evil was still preventable.
Chapter 12. My way lay through the city. I had scarcely entered it when I was seized with the general sensation of sickness. Every object grew dim and swam before my sight. It was with difficulty I prevented myself from sinking to the bottom of the carriage. I ordered myself to be carried to Mrs. Baynton's, in hope that an interval of repose would invigorate and refresh me. My distracted thoughts would allow me but little rest. Growing somewhat better in the afternoon, I resumed my journey. My contemplations were limited to a few objects. I regarded my success, in the purpose of which I had a view, as considerably doubtful. I depended in some degree on the suggestions of the moment, and on the materials which Pleyel himself should furnish me. When I reflected on the nature of the accusation, I burned with disdain. Would not truth and the consciousness of innocence render me triumphant? Should I not cast from me, with irresistible force, such atrocious imputations? What an entire and mournful change has been effected in a few hours! The gulf that separates men from insects is not wider than that which severs the polluted from the chaste among women. Yesterday and today, I am the same. There is a degree of depravity to which it is impossible for me to sink. Yet, in the apprehension of another, my ancient and intimate associate, the perpetual witness of my actions and partaker of my thoughts, I had ceased to be the same. My integrity was tarnished and withered in his eyes. I was the colleague of a murderer and the paramour of a thief. His opinion was not destitute of evidence. Yet what proofs could reasonably avail to establish an opinion like this? If the sentiments corresponded not with the voice that was heard, the evidence was deficient. But this want of correspondence would have been supposed by me if I had been the auditor and Pleyel the criminal. But mimicry might still more plausibly have been employed to explain the scene. Alas, it is the fate of Clara Wieland to fall into the hands of a precipitate and inexorable judge. But what, O man of mischief, is the tendency of thy thoughts? Frustrated in thy first design, thou wilt not forego the immolation of thy victim. To exterminate my reputation was all that remained to thee, and this my guardian has permitted. To dispossess Pleyel of this prejudice may be impossible, but if that be effected, it cannot be supposed that thy wiles are exhausted. Thy cunning will discover innumerable avenues to the accomplishment of thy malignant purpose. Why should I enter the lists against thee? Would to heaven I could disarm thy vengeance by my deprecations. When I think of all the resources with which nature and education have supplied thee, that thy form is a combination of steely fibers and organs of exquisite ductility and boundless compass, actuated by an intelligence gifted with infinite endowments, and comprehending all knowledge, I perceive that my doom is fixed. What obstacle will be able to divert thy zeal, or repel thy efforts? That being who has hitherto protected me has borne testimony to the formidableness of thy attempts, since nothing less than supernatural interference could check thy career. Musing on these thoughts, I arrived, towards the close of the day, at Pleyel's house. A month before, I had traversed the same path, but now, how different were my sensations. Now I was seeking the presence of one who regarded me as the most degenerate of humankind. I was to plead the cause of my innocence against witnesses the most explicit and unerring of those which support the fabric of human knowledge. The nearer I approached the crisis, the more did my confidence decay. When the chaise stopped at the door, my strength refused to support me, and I threw myself into the arms of an ancient female domestic. I had not the courage to inquire whether her master was at home. I was tormented with fears that the projected journey was already undertaken. These fears were removed by her asking me whether she should call her young master, who had just gone into his own room. I was somewhat revived by this intelligence, and resolved immediately to seek him there. In my confusion of mind, I neglected to knock at the door, but entered his apartment without previous notice. This abruptness was altogether involuntary. Absorbed in reflections of such unspeakable moment, I had no leisure to heed the niceties of punctilio. I discovered him standing, with his back towards the entrance. A small trunk, with its lid raised, was before him, in which it seemed as if he had been busy in packing his clothes. The moment of my entrance, he was employed in gazing at something which he held in his hand. I imagined that I fully comprehended this scene. The image which he held before him, by which his attention was so deeply engaged, I doubted not to be my own. These preparations for his journey, the cause to which it was to be imputed, the hopelessness of success in the undertaking on which I had entered, rushed at once upon my feelings, and dissolved me into a flood of tears. Startled by this sound, he dropped the lid of the trunk and turned. The solemn sadness that previously overspread his countenance gave sudden way to an attitude and look of the most vehement astonishment. Perceiving me unable to uphold myself, he stepped towards me without speaking and supported me by his arm. The kindness of this action called forth a new effusion from my eyes. Weeping was a solace to which, at that time, I had not grown familiar, and which therefore was peculiarly delicious. Indignation was no longer to be read in the features of my friend. They were pregnant with a mixture of wonder and pity. Their expression was easily interpreted. This visit and these tears were tokens of my penitence. The wretch whom he had stigmatized as incurably and obdurately wicked had showed herself susceptible of remorse, and had come to confess her guilt. This persuasion had no tendency to comfort me. It only showed me with new evidence the difficulty of the task which I had assigned myself. We were mutually silent. I had less power and less inclination than ever to speak. I extricated myself from his hold and threw myself on a sofa. He placed himself by my side and appeared to wait with impatience and anxiety for some beginning of the conversation. What could I say? If my mind had suggested anything suitable to the occasion, my utterance was suffocated by tears. Frequently he attempted to speak, but seemed deterred by some degree of uncertainty as to the true nature of the scene. At last, in faltering accents, he spoke. "My friend, would to heaven I were still permitted to call you by that name. The image I once adored existed only in my fancy, but though I cannot hope to see it realized, you may not be totally insensible to the horrors of that gulf into which you are about to plunge. What heart is forever exempt from the goadings of compunction and the influx of laudable propensities? I thought you were accomplished and wise beyond the rest of women. Not a sentiment you uttered, not a look you assumed, that were not, in my apprehension, fraught with the sublimities of rectitude and the illuminations of genius. Deceit has some bounds. Your education could not be without influence. A vigorous understanding cannot be utterly devoid of virtue, but you could not counterfeit the powers of invention and reasoning. I was rash in my invectives. I will not, but with life, relinquish all hopes of you. I will shut out every proof that would tell me that your heart is incurably diseased. You come to restore me once more to happiness, to convince me that you have torn her mask from vice, and feel nothing but abhorrence for the part you have hitherto acted." At these words, my equanimity forsook me. For a moment, I forgot the evidence from which Pleyel's opinions were derived, the benevolence of his remonstrances, and the grief which his accents bespoke. I was filled with indignation and horror at charges so black. I shrunk back and darted at him a look of disdain and anger. My passion supplied me with words. What detestable infatuation it was that led me hither! Why do I patiently endure these horrible insults? My offenses exist only in your own distempered imagination. You are leagued with the traitor who assailed my life. You have vowed the destruction of my peace and honor. I deserve infamy for listening to calumnies so base." These words were heard by Pleyel without visible resentment. His countenance relapsed into its former gloom, but he did not even look at me. The ideas which had given place to my anger emotions returned, and once more melted me into tears. "Oh," I exclaimed, in a voice broken by sobs, "what a task is mine! Compelled to hearken to charges which I feel to be false, but which I know to be believed by him that utters them. Believed, too, not without evidence, which, though fallacious, is not unplausible. I came hither not to confess, but to vindicate. I know the source of your opinions. Wieland has informed me on what your suspicions are built. These suspicions are fostered by you as certainties. The tenor of my life, all of my conversations and letters, affords me no security. Every sentiment that my tongue and my pen have uttered bear testimony to the rectitude of my mind, but this testimony is rejected. I am condemned as brutally profligate. I am classed with the stupidly and sordidly wicked. And where are the proofs that must justify so foul and improbable an accusation? You have overheard a midnight conference. Voices have saluted your ear, in which you imagine yourself to have recognized mine, and that of a detected villain. The sentiments expressed were not allowed to outweigh the casual or concerted resemblance of voice. Sentiments the reverse of all those whose influence my former life had attested, denoting a mind polluted by groveling vices and entering into compact with that of a thief and a murderer. The nature of these sentiments did not enable you to detect the cheat, did not suggest to you the possibility that my voice had been counterfeited by another. You were precipitate and prone to condemn. Instead of rushing on the impostors and comparing the evidence of sight with that of hearing, you stood aloof, or you fled. My innocence would not now have stood in need of vindication if this conduct had been pursued. That you did not pursue it, your present thoughts incontestably prove. Yet this conduct might surely have been expected from Pleyel, that he would not hastily impute the blackest of crimes, that he would not couple my name with infamy, and cover me with ruin for inadequate or slight reasons, might reasonably have been expected. The sobs which convulsed my bosom would not suffer me to proceed. Pleyel was for a moment affected. He looked at me with some expression of doubt, but this quickly gave place to a mournful solemnity. He fixed his eyes on the floor as if in reverie, and spoke. 2 hours hence am I gone. Shall I carry away with me the sorrow that is now my guest, or shall that sorrow be accumulated tenfold? What is she that is now before me? Shall every hour supply me with new proofs of a wickedness beyond example? Already I deem her the most abandoned and detestable of human creatures. Her coming and her tears imparted a gleam of hope, but that gleam has vanished. He now fixed his eyes upon me, and every muscle in his face trembled. His tone was hollow and terrible. Thou knowest that I was a witness of your interview, yet thou comest hither to upbraid me for injustice. Thou canst look at me in the face and say that I am deceived. An inscrutable providence has fashioned thee for some end. Thou wilt live, no doubt, to fulfill the purposes of thy Maker, if he repent not of his workmanship, and send not his vengeance to exterminate thee, ere the measure of thy days be full. Surely nothing in the shape of man can vie with thee. But I thought I had stifled this fury. I am not constituted thy judge. My office is to pity and to amend, and not to punish and revile. I deemed myself exempt from all tempestuous passions. I had almost persuaded myself to weep over thy fall, but I am frail as dust and mutable as water. I am calm, I am compassionate only in thy absence. Make this house, this room, thy abode as long as thou wilt, but forgive me if I prefer solitude for the short time during which I shall stay. Saying this, he motioned as if to leave the apartment. The stormy passions of this man affected me by sympathy. I ceased to weep. I was motionless and speechless with agony. I sat with my hands clasped, mutely gazing after him as he withdrew. I desired to detain him, but was unable to make any effort for that purpose, till he had passed out of the room. Then I uttered an involuntary and piercing cry. "Pleyel! Art thou gone? Gone forever?" At this summons he hastily returned. He beheld me wild, pale, gasping for breath, and my head already sinking on my bosom. A painful dizziness seized me, and I fainted away. When I recovered, I found myself stretched out on a bed in the outer apartment, and Pleyel, with 2 female servants standing beside it. All the fury and scorn which the countenance of the former lately expressed had now disappeared, and was succeeded by the most tender anxiety. As soon as he perceived that my senses were returned to me, he clasped his hands and exclaimed, "God be thanked, you are once more alive. I had almost despaired of your recovery. I fear I have been precipitate and unjust. My senses must have been the victims of some inexplicable and momentary frenzy. Forgive me, I beseech you, forgive my reproaches. I would purchase conviction of your purity at the price of my existence here and hereafter." He once more, in a tone of the most fervent tenderness, besought me to be composed, and then left me to the care of the women. Chapter 13. Here was wrought a surprising change in my friend. What was it that had shaken conviction so firm? Had anything occurred during my fit adequate to produce so total an alteration? My attendants informed me that he had not left my apartment, that the unusual duration of my fit, and the failure, for a time, of all the means used for my recovery, had filled him with grief and dismay. Did he regard the effect which his reproaches had produced as proof of my sincerity? In this state of mind, I little regarded my languors of body. I rose and requested an interview with him before my departure, on which I was resolved, notwithstanding his earnest solicitation, to spend the night at his house. He complied with my request. The tenderness which he had lately betrayed had now disappeared, and he had once more relapsed into a chilling solemnity. I told him that I was preparing to return to my brother's, that I had come hither to vindicate my innocence from the foul aspersions which he had cast upon it. My pride had not taken refuge in silence or distance. I had not relied upon time or the suggestion of his cooler thoughts to confute his charges. Conscious as I was that I was perfectly guiltless, and entertaining some value for his good opinion, I could not prevail upon myself to believe that my efforts to make my innocence manifest would be fruitless. Adverse appearances might be numerous and specious, but they were unquestionably false. I was willing to believe him sincere, that he made no charges which he himself did not believe, but these charges were destitute of truth. The grounds of his opinion were fallacious. I desired an opportunity of detecting their fallacy. I entreated him to be explicit, and to give me a detail of what he had heard and what he had seen. At these words, my companion's countenance grew darker. He appeared to be struggling with his rage. He opened his lips to speak, but his accents died away ere they were formed. This conflict lasted for some minutes, but his fortitude was finally successful. He spoke as follows. I would fain put an end to this hateful scene. What I shall say will be breath idly and unprofitably consumed. The clearest narrative will add nothing to your present knowledge. You are acquainted with the grounds of my opinion, and yet you avow yourself innocent. Why then should I rehearse these grounds? You are apprised of the character of Carwin. Why then should I enumerate the discoveries which I have made respecting him? Yet, since it is your request, since, considering the limitedness of human faculties, some error may possibly lurk in those appearances which I have witnessed, I will briefly relate what I know. Need I dwell upon the impressions which your conversation and deportment originally made upon me? We parted in childhood, but our intercourse, by letter, was copious and uninterrupted. How fondly did I anticipate a meeting with one whom her letters had previously taught me to consider as the first of women, and how fully realized were the expectations that I had formed. Here, said I, is a being after whom sages may model their transcendent intelligence, and painters their ideal beauty. Here is exemplified that union between intellect and form which has hitherto existed only in the conceptions of the poet. I have watched your eyes, my attention has hung upon your lips. I have questioned whether the enchantments of your voice were more conspicuous in the intricacies of melody or the emphasis of rhetoric. I have marked the transitions of your discourse, the felicities of your expression, your refined augmentation and glowing imagery, and have been forced to acknowledge that all delights were meager and contemptible compared with those connected with the audience and sight of you. I've contemplated your principles, and been astonished at the solidity of their foundation and the perfection of their structure. I have traced you to your home. I have viewed you in relation to your servants, to your family, to your neighbors, and to the world. I have seen by what skillful arrangements you facilitate the performance of the most arduous and complicated duties, what daily accessions of strength your judicious discipline bestowed upon your memory, what correctness and abundance of knowledge was daily experienced by your unwearied application to books and to writing. If she that possesses so much in the bloom of youth will go on accumulating her stores, what, said I, is the picture she will display at a mature age? You know not the accuracy of my observation. I was desirous that others should profit by an example so rare. I therefore noted down in writing every particular of your conduct. I was anxious to benefit by an opportunity so seldom afforded us. I labored not to omit the slightest shade or the most petty line in your portrait. Here there was no other task incumbent upon me but to copy. There was no need to exaggerate or overlook in order to produce a more unexceptionable pattern. Here was a combination of harmonies and graces incapable of diminution or accession without injury to its completeness. I found no end and no bounds to my task. No display of a scene like this could be chargeable with redundancy or superfluity. Even the color of a shoe, the knot of a ribbon, or your attitude in plucking a rose were a moment to be recorded. Even the arrangements of your breakfast table and your toilet have been amply displayed. I know that mankind are more easily enticed to virtue by examples than by precept. I know that the absoluteness of a model, when supplied by invention, diminishes its salutary influence. Since it is useful, we think to strive after that which we know to be beyond our reach. But the picture which I drew was not a phantom. As a model, it was devoid of imperfection, and to aspire to that height which had been really attained was by no means unreasonable. I had another and more interesting object in view. One existed who claimed all my tenderness. Here, in all its parts, was a model worthy of assiduous study and indefatigable imitation. I called upon her, as she wished to secure and enhance my esteem, to mold her thoughts, her words, her countenance, her actions by this pattern. The task was exuberant of pleasure, and I was deeply engaged in it, when an imp of mischief was let loose in the form of Carwin. I admired his powers and accomplishments. I did not wonder that they were admired by you. On the rectitude of your judgment, however, I relied to keep this admiration within discreet and scrupulous bounds. I assured myself that the strangeness of his deportment and the obscurity of his life would teach you caution. Of all errors, my knowledge of your character informed me that this was least likely to befall you. You were powerfully affected by his first appearance. You were bewitched by his countenance and his tones. Your description was ardent and pathetic. I listened to you with some emotions of surprise. The portrait you drew in his absence, and the intensity with which you mused upon it, were new and unexpected incidents. They bespoke a sensibility somewhat too vivid, but from which, while subjected to the guidance of an understanding like yours, there was nothing to dread. A more direct intercourse took place between you. I need not apologize for the solicitude which I entertained for your safety. He that gifted me with perception of excellence compelled me to love it. In the midst of danger and pain, my contemplations have ever been cheered by your image. Every object in competition with you was worthless and trivial. No price was too great by which your safety could be purchased. For that end, the sacrifice of ease, of health, and even of life would cheerfully have been made by me. What wonder, then, that I scrutinized the sentiments and deportment of this man with ceaseless vigilance, that I watched your words and your looks when he was present, and that I extracted cause for the deepest inquietudes from every token which you gave of having put your happiness into this man's keeping. I was cautious in deciding. I recalled the various conversations in which the topics of love and marriage had been discussed. As a woman, young, beautiful, and independent, it behooved you to have fortified your mind with just principles on the subject. Your principles were eminently just. Had not their rectitude and their firmness been attested by your treatment of that specious seducer, Dashwood? These principles, I was prone to believe, exempted you from danger in this new state of things. I was not the last to pay my homage to the unrivaled capacity, insinuation, and eloquence of this man. I have disguised, but could never stifle the conviction that his eyes and voice had a witchcraft in them, which rendered him truly formidable. But I reflected on the ambiguous expression of his countenance, an ambiguity which you were the first to remark, on the cloud which obscured his character, and on the suspicious nature of that concealment which he studied, and concluded you to be safe. I denied the obvious construction to appearances. I referred your conduct to some principle which had not been hitherto discussed, but which was reconcilable with those already known. I was not suffered to remain long in this suspense. One evening, you may recollect, I came to your house, where it was my purpose, as usual, to lodge, somewhat earlier than ordinary. I spied a light in your chamber, as I approached from the outside, and, on inquiring of Judith, I was informed that you were writing. As your kinsman and friend and fellow lodger, I thought I had a right to be familiar. You were in your chamber, but your employment and the time were such as to make it no infraction of decorum to follow you thither. The spirit of mischievous gaiety possessed me. I proceeded on tiptoe. You did not perceive my entrance, and I advanced softly till I was able to overlook your shoulder. I had gone thus far in error, and had no power to recede. How cautiously should we guard against the first inroads of temptation? I knew that to pry into your papers was criminal, but I reflected that no sentiment of yours was of a nature which made it your interest to conceal it. You wrote much more than you permitted your friends to peruse. My curiosity was strong. I had only to throw a glance upon the paper to secure its gratification. I should never have deliberately committed an act like this. The slightest obstacle would have repelled me, but my eye glanced almost spontaneously upon the paper. I caught only parts of sentences, but my eyes comprehended more at a glance, because the characters were shorthand. I lighted on the words "summer house," "midnight," and made out a passage which spoke of the propriety and the effects to be expected from another interview. All this passed in less than a moment. I then checked myself and made myself known to you by a tap upon your shoulder. I could pardon and account for some trifling alarm, but your trepidation and blushes were excessive. You hurried the paper out of sight, and seemed too anxious to discover whether I knew the contents to allow yourself to make any inquiries. I wondered at these appearances of consternation, but did not reason on them until I had retired. When alone, these incidents suggested to themselves to my reflections anew. To what scene, or what interview, I asked, did you allude? Your disappearance on a former evening, my tracing you to the recesses of the bank, your silence on my first and second call, your vague answers and invincible embarrassment when you at length ascended the hill, I recollected with new surprise. Could this be the summer house alluded to? A certain timidity and consciousness had generally attended you when this incident and this recess had been the subjects of conversation. Nay, I imagined that the last time that adventure was mentioned, which happened in the presence of Carwin, the countenance of the latter betrayed some emotion. Could the interview have been with him? This was an idea calculated to rouse every faculty to contemplation. An interview at that hour, in this darksome retreat with a man of that mysterious but formidable character, a clandestine interview, and one which you afterwards endeavored with so much solicitude to conceal. It was a fearful and portentous occurrence. I could not measure his power or fathom his designs. Had he rifled from you the secret of your love, and reconciled you to concealment and nocturnal meetings? I scarcely ever spent a night of more inquietude. I knew not how to act. The ascertainment of this man's character and views seemed to be in the first place necessary. Had he openly preferred his suit to you, we should have been empowered to make direct inquiries. But since he had chosen this obscure path, it seemed reasonable to infer that his character was exceptionable. It at least subjected us to the necessity of resorting to other means of information. Yet the improbability that you should commit a deed of such rashness made me reflect anew upon the insufficiency of those grounds on which my suspicions had been built, and almost to condemn myself for harboring them. Though it was mere conjecture that the interview spoken of had taken place with Carwin, yet two ideas occurred to involve me in the most painful doubts. This man's reasonings might be so specious and his artifices so profound that, aided by the passion which you had conceived for him, he had finally succeeded, or his situation might be such as to justify the secrecy which you maintained. In neither case did my wildest reveries suggest to me that your honor had been forfeited. I could not talk with you on this subject. If the imputation was false, its atrociousness would have justly drawn upon me your resentment, and I must have explained by what facts it had been suggested. If it were true, no benefit would follow from the mention of it. You had chosen to conceal it for some reasons, and whether these reasons were true or false, it was proper to discover and remove them in the first place. Finally, I acquiesced in the least painful supposition, trammelled as it was with perplexities, that Carwin was upright, and that if the reasons of your silence were known, they would be found to be just. Chapter 14. 3 days have elapsed since this occurrence. I have been haunted by perpetual inquietude. To bring myself to regard Carwin without terror, and to acquiesce in the belief of your safety, was impossible. Yet to put an end to my doubts, seemed to be impracticable. If some light could be reflected on the actual situation of this man, a direct path would present itself. If he were, contrary to the tenor of his conversation, cunning and malignant, to apprise you of this would be to place you in security. If he were merely unfortunate and innocent, most readily would I espouse his cause, and if his intentions were upright with regard to you, most eagerly would I sanctify your choice by my approbation. It would be vain to call upon Carwin for an avowal of his deeds. It was better to know nothing than to be deceived by an artful tale. What he was unwilling to communicate, and this unwillingness had been repeatedly manifested, could never be extorted from him. Importunity might be appeased, or imposture effected by the fallacious representations. To the rest of the world he was unknown. I had often made him the subject of discourse, but a glimpse of his figure in the street was the sum of their knowledge who knew most. None had ever seen him before, and received as new the information which my intercourse with him in Valencia and my present intercourse enabled me to give. Wieland was your brother. If he had really made you the object of his courtship, was not a brother authorized to interfere and demand from him the confession of his views? Yet what were the grounds on which I had reared this supposition? Would they justify a measure like this? Surely not. In the course of my restless meditations, it occurred to me at length that my duty required me to speak to you, and confess the indecorum of which I had been guilty, and to state the reflections to which it had led me. I was prompted by no mean or selfish views. The heart within my breast was not more precious than your safety. Most cheerfully would I have interposed my life between you and danger. Would you cherish resentment at my conduct? When acquainted with the motive which produced it, it would not only exempt me from censure, but entitle me to gratitude. Yesterday had been selected for the rehearsal of the newly imported tragedy. I promised to be present. The state of my thoughts but little qualified me for performer or auditor in such a scene. But I reflected that after it was finished, I should return home with you, and should then enjoy an opportunity of discoursing with you fully on the topic. My resolution was not formed without a remnant of doubt as to its propriety. When I left this house to perform the visit I had promised, my mind was full of apprehension and despondency. The dubiousness of the event of our conversation, fear that my interference was too late to secure your peace, and the uncertainty to which hope gave birth, whether I had not erred in believing you devoted to this man, or at least in imagining that he had obtained your consent to midnight conferences, distracted me with contradictory opinions and repugnant emotions. I can assign no reason for calling at Mrs. Bainton's. I had seen her in the morning, and knew her to be well. The concerted hour had nearly arrived, and yet I turned up the street which leads to her house, and dismounted at her door. I entered the parlor and threw myself in a chair. I saw and inquired for no one. My whole frame was overpowered by dreary and comfortless sensations. One idea possessed me wholly: the inexpressible importance of unveiling the designs and character of Carwin, and the utter improbability that this ever would be effected. Some instinct induced me to lay my hand upon a newspaper. I had perused all the general intelligence it contained in the morning, and at the same spot. The act was rather mechanical than voluntary. I threw a languid glance at the first column that presented itself. The first words which I read began with the offer of a reward of 300 guineas for the apprehension of a convict under sentence of death who had escaped from Newgate Prison in Dublin. Good heaven, how every fibre of my frame tingled when I proceeded to read the name of the criminal was Francis Carwin. The descriptions of his person, his address, were minute. His stature, hair, complexion, the extraordinary position and arrangement of his features, the awkward and disproportionate form, his gesture and gait, correspond perfectly with those of our mysterious visitant. He had been found guilty in 2 indictments. One for the murder of the Lady Jane Conway, and the other for a robbery committed on the person of the Honourable Mr. Ludlow. I repeatedly perused this passage. The ideas which flowed in upon my mind affected me like an instant transition from death to life. The purpose dearest to my heart was thus effected, at a time and by means the least of all others within the scope of my foresight. But what purpose? Carwin was detected. Acts of the blackest and most sordid guilt had been committed by him. Here was evidence which imparted to my understanding the most luminous certainty. The name, visage, and deportment were the same. Between the time of his escape and his appearance among us, there was a sufficient agreement. Such was the man with whom I suspected you to maintain a clandestine correspondence. Should I not haste to snatch you from the talons of this vulture? Should I see you rushing to the verge of a dizzy precipice, and not stretch forth a hand to pull you back? I had no need to deliberate. I thrust the paper in my pocket, and resolved to obtain an immediate conference with you. For a time no other image made its way to my understanding. At length it occurred to me that though the information I possessed was, in one sense, sufficient, yet if more could be obtained, more was desirable. This passage was copied from a British paper. Part of it only, perhaps, was transcribed. The printer was in possession of the original. Towards his house I immediately turned to my horse's head. He produced the paper, but I found nothing more than what had already been seen. While busy in perusing it, the printer stood by my side. He noticed the object of which I was in search. "Ah," he said, "that's a strange affair. I should never have met with it, had not Mr. Hallett sent to me the paper with the particular request to republish the advertisement." Mr. Hallett, what reasons could he have for making this request? Had the paper sent to him been accompanied by any information respecting the convict? Had he personal or extraordinary reasons for desiring its republication? This was to be known in only one way. I speeded to his house. In answer to my interrogations, he told me that Ludlow had formerly been in America, and that during his residence in this city, considerable intercourse had taken place between them. Hence a confidence arose, which has since been kept alive by occasional letters. He had lately received a letter from him, enclosing a newspaper from which this extract had been made. He put it into my hands and pointed out the passages which related to Carwin. Ludlow confirms the facts of his conviction and escape, and adds that he had reason to believe him to have embarked for America. He describes him in general terms, as the most incomprehensible and formidable among men, as engaged in schemes reasonably suspected to be, in the highest degree, criminal, but such as no human intelligence is able to unravel. That his ends are pursued by means which leave it in doubt whether he be not in league with some infernal spirit. That his crimes have hitherto been perpetrated with the aid of some unknown but desperate accomplices. That he wages a perpetual war against the happiness of mankind, and sets his engines of destruction at work against every object that presents itself. This is the substance of the letter. Hallett expressed some surprise at the curiosity which was manifested by me on this occasion. I was too much absorbed by the ideas suggested by this letter to pay attention to his remarks. I shuddered with the apprehension of the evil to which our indiscreet familiarity with this man had probably exposed us. I burnt with impatience to see you, and to do what in me lay to avert the calamity which threatened us. It was already 5 o'clock. Night was hastening, and there was no time to be lost. On leaving Mr. Hallett's house, who should meet me in the street but Bertrand, the servant whom I left in Germany? His appearance and accoutrements bespoke him of having just alighted from a toilsome and long journey. I was not wholly without expectation of seeing him about this time, but no one was then more distant from my thoughts. You know what reasons I have for anxiety respecting scenes with which this man was conversant. Carwin was for a moment forgotten. In answer to my vehement inquiries, Bertrand produced a copious packet. I shall not at present mention its contents, nor the measures which they obliged me to adopt. I bestowed a brief perusal on these papers, and having given some directions to Bertrand, resumed my purpose with regard to you. My horse I was obliged to resign to my servant, he being charged with a commission that required speed. The clock had struck 10, and Mettingen was 5 miles distant. I was to journey thither on foot. These circumstances only added to my expedition. As I passed swiftly along, I reviewed all the incidents accompanying the appearance and deportment of that man among us. Late events have been inexplicable and mysterious, beyond any of which I have either read or heard. These events were coeval with Carwin's introduction. I am unable to explain their origin and mutual dependence, but I do not, on that account, believe them to have a supernatural origin. Is not this man the agent? Some of them seem to be propitious, but what should I think of those threats of assassination with which you were lately alarmed? Bloodshed is the trade, and horror is the element of this man. The process by which the sympathies of nature are extinguished in our hearts, by which evil is made our good, and by which we are made susceptible of no activity but the infliction, and no joy but in the spectacle of woes, is an obvious process. As to an alliance with evil geniuses, the power and the malice of demons have been 1,000 times exemplified in human beings. There are no devils but those which are begotten upon selfishness and reared by cunning. Now, indeed, the scene was changed. It was not his secret poniard that I dreaded. It was only the success of his efforts to make you a confederate in your own destruction, to make your will the instrument by which he might bereave you of liberty and honor. I took, as usual, the path through your brother's ground. I ranged with celerity and silence along the bank. I approached the fence which divides Wieland's estate from yours. The recess in the bank being near this line, it being necessary for me to pass near it, my mind being tainted with inveterate suspicions concerning you, suspicions which were indebted for their strength to incidents connected with this spot. What wonder that it seized upon my thoughts! I leaped on the fence, but before I descended on the opposite side, I paused to survey the scene. Leaves dropping with dew and glistening in the moon's rays, with no moving object to molest the deep repose, filled me with security and hope. I left the station at length and tended forward. You were probably at rest. How should I communicate without alarming you the intelligence of my arrival? An immediate interview was to be procured. I could not bear to think that a minute should be lost by reminiscence or hesitation. Should I knock at the door, or should I stand under your chamber windows, which I perceived to be open, and awaken you by my calls? These reflections employed me as I passed opposite to the summer-house. I had scarcely gone by when my ear caught a sound unusual at this time and place. It was almost too faint and too transient to allow me a distinct perception of it. I stopped to listen. Presently it was heard again, and now it was somewhat in a louder key. It was laughter, and unquestionably produced by a female voice. That voice was familiar to my senses. It was yours. Whence it came, I was at first at a loss to conjecture, but this uncertainty vanished when it was heard a third time. I threw back my eyes towards the recess. Every other organ and limb was useless to me. I did not reason on the subject. I did not in a direct manner draw my conclusions from the hour, the place, the hilarity which this sound betokened, and the circumstance of having a companion, which it no less incontestably proved. In an instant, as it were, my heart was invaded with cold, and the pulses of life at a stand. Why should I go further? Why should I return? Should I not hurry to a distance from a sound which, though formerly so sweet and delectable, was now more hideous than the shrieks of owls? I had no time to yield to this impulse. The thought of approaching and listening occurred to me. I had no doubt of which I was conscious, yet my certainty was capable of increase. I was likewise stimulated by the sentiment that partook of rage. I was governed by a half-formed and tempestuous resolution to break in upon your interview and strike you dead with my upbraiding. I approached with the utmost caution. When I reached the edge of the bank immediately above the summer-house, I thought I heard voices from below, as busy in conversation. The steps in the rock are clear of bushy impediments. They allowed me to descend into a cavity beside the building without being detected. Thus, to lie in wait could only be justified by the momentousness of the occasion. Here Pleyel paused in his narrative and fixed his eyes upon me. Situated as I was, my horror and astonishment at this tale gave way to compassion for the anguish which the countenance of my friend betrayed. I reflected on his force of understanding. I reflected on the powers of my enemy. I could easily divine the substance of the conversation that was overheard. Carwin had constructed his plot in a manner suited to the characters of those whom he had selected for his victims. I saw that the convictions of Pleyel were immutable. I forbore to struggle against the storm, because I saw that all struggles would be fruitless. I was calm, but my calmness was the torpor of despair, and not the tranquility of fortitude. It was calmness invincible by anything that his grief and fury could suggest to Pleyel. He resumed. Woman, wilt thou hear me further? Shall I go on to repeat the conversation? Is it shame that makes thee tongue-tied? Shall I go on, or art thou satisfied with what has already been said? I bowed my head. Go on, said I. I make not this request in the hope of undeceiving you. I shall no longer contend with my own weakness. The storm is let loose, and I shall peaceably submit to be driven by its fury. But go on. This conference will end only with affording me a clearer foresight of my destiny. But that will be some satisfaction, and I will not part without it. Why, on hearing these words, did Pleyel hesitate? Did some unlooked-for doubt insinuate itself into his mind? Was his belief suddenly shaken by my looks, or my words, or by some newly recollected circumstance? Whencesoever it arose, it could not endure the test of deliberation. In a few minutes, the flame of resentment was again lighted up in his bosom. He proceeded with his accustomed vehemence. I hate myself for this folly. I can find no apology for this tale, yet I am irresistibly impelled to relate it. She that hears me is apprised of every particular. I have only to repeat to her her own words. She will listen with a tranquil air, and the spectacle of her obduracy will drive me to some desperate act. Why then should I persist? Yet persist I must. Again he paused. No, said he, it is impossible to repeat your avowals of love, your appeals to former confessions of your tenderness, to former deeds of dishonor, to the circumstances of the first interview that took place between you. It was on that night when I traced you to this recess. Thither had he enticed you, and there you had ratified an unhallowed compact by admitting him. Great God, thou witnessed the agonies that tore my bosom at that moment. Thou witnessed my efforts to repel the testimony of my ears. It was in vain that you dwelt upon the confusion which my unlooked-for summons excited in you, the tardiness with which a suitable excuse occurred to you. Your resentment that my impertinent intrusion had put an end to that charming interview. A disappointment for which you endeavored to compensate yourself by the frequency and duration of subsequent meetings. In vain you dwelt upon incidents of which you only could be conscious, incidents that occurred on occasions which none beside your own family were witnesses. In vain was your discourse characterized by peculiarities inimitable of sentiment and language. My conviction was affected only by an accumulation of the same tokens. I yielded not but to evidence which took away the power to withhold my faith. My sight was of no use to me. Beneath so thick an umbrage, the darkness was intense. Hearing was the only avenue to information which the circumstances allowed to be open. I was couched within 3 feet of you. Why should I approach nearer? I could not contend with your betrayer. What could be the purpose of a contest? You stood in no need of a protector. What could I do but retire from the spot, overwhelmed with confusion and dismay? I sought my chamber and endeavored to regain my composure. The door of the house, which I found open, your subsequent entrance, closing and fastening it, and going into your chamber, which had been thus long deserted, were only confirmations of the truth. Why should I paint the tempestuous fluctuation of my thoughts between grief and revenge, between rage and despair? Why should I repeat my vows of internal implacability and persecution, and the speedy recantation of these vows? I've said enough. You have dismissed me from a place in your esteem. What I think and what I feel is of no importance in your eyes. May the duty which I owe myself enable me to forget your existence. In a few minutes, I go hence. Be the maker of your fortune, and may adversity instruct you in that wisdom which education was unable to impart to you. Those were the last words which Pleyel uttered. He left the room, and my new emotions enabled me to witness his departure without any apparent loss of composure. As I sat alone, I ruminated on these incidents. Nothing was more evident than that I had taken an eternal leave of happiness. life was a worthless thing, separate from that good which had now been wrested from me. Yet the sentiment that now possessed me had no tendency to palsy my exertions and overbear my strength. I noticed that the light was declining, and perceived the propriety of leaving this house. I placed myself again in the chaise, and returned slowly towards the city. This concludes Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Wieland, or The Transformation, by Charles Brockden Brown. Join us next episode, when Mare and I will break down these chapters and kind of figure out what's going on. See you then.